recordings.
It's like Anna's recordings, so.
All right, I see this circle. So this is, I put this together because I was getting a lot of phone calls about the proposed regulations that were going to go into effect. And what I was beginning to understand was the issue wasn't just the gigantic increase in salary, it was a basic misunderstanding about what is an exempt staff person and what is a non-exempt staff person. So that's why I put this together. Whatever they decide to do with the new rules, we'll deal with that at the time. But I thought if we had a good understanding of how this is supposed to work, it'll be easier to understand what the changes are. So we're going to play a little definition of terms, and the first term I wanted to define was full-time. There really are two meanings of that. There are work hour definitions, and then there are definitions for benefits. So, for example, in your personnel policy for benefits, if you say if you work 32 hours or 35 hours or take your pick, you're considered full-time. That means you're able to access all the full-time benefits your library offers. Social Security match and Medicare match, they happen on the first penny paid. Same is true with unemployment, and workers' compensation depends on the size of your payroll. But those are all benefits from the employer perspective. For the employee, sometimes disability insurance that the organization may have, or the 457 plan, you know, or other compensation plans may have a work week requirement, minimum hours. Primary offender there is health insurance, and often in a group policy, they'll say any employees that work 32 hours are considered full-time. Now, for compensation, for take-home pay you put in the bank, the Fair Labor Standards Act defines a full-time as 40 hours in a work week. And this applies to you however you're paid, whether you're classified as an hourly employee or a salaried employee. Salaried employees can be exempt or non-exempt. Overtime in this setting is a time and a half for any hours that exceed 40 hours in your work week. That's kind of a long-held standard, and it's so ingrained that when we did our accreditation standards, we talked at libraries of a certain size should have a full-time director. And what we've discovered, and we will be correcting, is that needed to say that works 40 hours a week. You may only have to work 32 hours to be full-time for benefits, but really, in the mind of the accreditation committee, full-time was the traditional 40 hours a week. And we'll be clearing that up as time goes on in terms of being really clear with our language. So basically, overtime happens once you trip over 40 hours a week. For not businesses that are not required to be under the Fair Labor Standards Act, Kansas work week is 46 hours a week before you have to pay overtime. So there are some businesses out there that do not have to pay overtime until they go over 46 hours. But libraries are a government entity, and as such, you're required to be under the Fair Labor Standards Act unless your state is even more stringent. In this case, it's 40 hours a week. So if you have a person that you put an ad in the paper and you hired them, and the ad said, we want you to work this job for $36,000 a year. You could convert that to an hourly rate by dividing it by 2,080. You're going to figure out how much that is per hour. So you could turn around and convert that salary in the ad to time. When they turn their timesheet in, you're going to pay them by the hour. That's not an exempt employee, just so you know. But that is, that when you use the terms salaried and hourly, it gets very, very confusing because people pay in a variety of ways. A purely hourly paid employee is almost never exempt. A salaried hourly employee may be exempt. And purely salaried employees are typically exempt if they meet all the FLSA tests. So the first thing you have to do to understand this exempt, non-exempt overtime confusion is to know that your work week should be defined in your personnel policy. And it should be defined from the library's perspective so that you minimize situations that would create overtime. We here at Nichols, our work week is not Sunday through Saturday, which is what I think the standard work week is to most people. Our work week runs Saturday through Friday. Our non-exempt staff would typically be upgrading computers and working on things on the weekend when we first defined our work week. And by starting the work week on Saturday, we could make sure they didn't get into a situation where they needed compensatory time off. We would try to work it in within that one work week to make sure they only hit 40 hours. So you need to set your work weeks that work best for your library. If your library is open on the weekends, and sometimes that is the hardest time for people to hit the clock off point, maybe you start there rather than try to end there. It's just a thought, but I think it's really important that you think about it and you define that work week. So if we've defined our work week, then we start with what is an exempt employee. And I've listed the things, and these requirements must all be met. Think of this as a three-legged stool. You have a salary level, you have a salary basis, and you have to meet one of the job duties tests. You have to meet them all to have an exempt employee. So we're kind of going to look at these tests, and we're going to talk about what is and what isn't in play. So if you look here, what I have going is the rule that what is in effect currently, or was in effect until the new ones were supposed to go into effect. The old rule from 2004. How about that? So the existing rule said you had to pay people at least 455 hours a week or $23,660 annually. That's the equivalent of $11.38 an hour. FLSA was passed originally in 1975, and it set a minimum wage and the requirements for overtime. This salary was adjusted in 2004. So they went from 1975 to 2004, and when they made this tiny adjustment in the salary level. When they did that, when the law was first passed, over 65% of the people working were covered under the overtime rule. In 2004, when they raised this only hits 7,000, most everybody makes more than this. It's down to 7% as a functional level. So the desire to increase it, I understand. The new rule, however, about gave everybody a heart attack. Because the new rule said, okay, we're going to raise the salary level from $23,660 to $47,476 annually, or the equivalent of $22.83 an hour. Not quite double the threshold. People were just having fits left, right, and all over the place, and a lot of complaints were going on. And as a result, in Texas, they took them to court, and they got an injunction, and this is now in limbo. It will not go into effect until somebody comes back and readdresses this. So the choices are, it never gets addressed and it stays at $23,660, or very likely the legislature will come in and maybe do some graduated increases that aren't so dramatic. Obama did this kind of by executive fiat, and this is going to end up coming back to the legislature, I have a feeling. The one point about the new rule that was good was that the salary level would be updated every 3 years. So they would never again get so far behind. It's kind of like with your budget. If you never increase and you never increase, and all of a sudden, you're really going to fall off the cliff, unless you do a large increase. People get excited. But if you actually have a good long-range plan and you're marching in step to meet a goal, you don't ever have to go to the giant increase. Well, they've left this for a long time, so I fully expect it will be increased. But now we need to know what that means. So what this is saying is, first test, if you pay the person at least $23,660, that meets the first test. So they tentatively are exempt. Okay? And we're happy about it. Now, the next test is a basis test. And that has to do with how you're paid, or what affects your take-home pay. The existing rule says the employee must be paid a predetermined and fixed amount that is not subject to reduction because of quality or quantity of work performed, and that did not change under the new rule. So what does that really mean? What that means is that you can't reduce the amount the person is paid in the pay period because of variations in the quality or quantity of the employee's work. So if I'm a true salaried employee and I make $36,000 a year and I have a pay period that's monthly, then I'm making $3,000 a month. So I'm taking $36,000 and dividing it by 12, and I'm going to pay myself $3,000 a month. Now, if I routinely only work 25 hours and I'm doing a crappy job, you can't reduce my salary because I did that. What you should do is fire me. These people don't turn in a timesheet that clocks when they show up, when they go to lunch, when they come back from lunch, and when they go home. Their timesheets reflect leave usage. Now, you can make some deductions. But it has to be for reasons not covered in your leave policy. You will have an employee that's a salary, we've had it here. You'll have a salaried exempt employee that has had a major illness or a major problem in the family. They've used all their vacation and all their sick leave. If they're going to be gone for full days, you can deduct, a day's pay off of their salary. If they have to have jury duty, or they're a witness in a trial, or they have summer camp for reserve people, you can pay them the difference between what they got in that situation and what their salary would be. That's allowed. You could deduct an entire week if they were gone for those allowed reasons. They have to have approved leave. They can't just not show up. But if you do dock them, or you do track their hours, and you move that paycheck dollar amount around, you're jeopardizing that exempt classification. And when you jeopardize that exempt classification, that means that you now, as the employer, are subject if the IRS gets involved or the state wage and hour people get involved for any reason. You may have to pay overtime pay to these people, penalties and interest. So it behooves you to make sure that you truly understand you have a minimum salary level to be classified exempt. You need to have a set amount that's paid during your pay period. If you're bi-monthly, it should be a set amount twice a month, or semi-monthly, or bi-weekly, I guess I should say. Every other week, it should be a set amount. You divide that by 26 pay periods. You divide the total amount of what the salary was by 26. It's the same dollar amount every pay period. It's not tracked on an hourly basis. For example, if you have a paycheck, you know that the monthly hours can vary between, say I pay on the 20th of a month, and I go, so the time would be, for example, in February, if we look at this, I'm going to write the February 20th paychecks. Usually the hours would be January 20th to February 19th. That would be your pay period if you're a monthly filer. And most of you only pay once a month, and God knows that's enough paperwork for anybody. But some places do bi-weekly checks. Some people do semi-monthly, which is twice a month. But know that it has to be the same amount every time, unless there are allowable deduction reasons. So I have a level of, and I have a basis of payment, and those are okay. Now we have the third leg of the stool, which is the job duties test. I'm going to stop for a second because I'm doing this 100 miles an hour. Does anybody have any questions so far? Jerry, is this clear to you? Jackie, is this clear to you? Mike? Does that, what I said made sense?
I had a quick question.
Sure.
About salaried employees and timesheets. So that's pretty standard because we are having our 3 salaried employees do a timesheet. So is that?
Well, we do a timesheet here. But
Okay.
The key is the only thing a salaried employee, an exempt employee, the only thing that they show on the timesheet is what's vacation and what's sick leave.
Okay, but they don't, okay.
They show their leave, so you can get that accounted for, but they don't show the in and out.
Okay.
For others.
Okay.
Okay? Anybody else? Okay. Moving along, isn't this just fun? This is so much fun. So, job duties test. Your job title doesn't determine your exempt status. There are a lot of library directors that have the title, that have the responsibility, that they can't meet the duties tests. You could be able to meet the duties tests, but the way the job description is written and how you're paid, you still might not qualify. Just because you can meet this leg of the three-legged stool does not mean you are exempt for sure. You have to meet all three. All right, moving on. These get to be so much fun. Exempt status. So I want to claim an executive exemption. And I've written my job description to meet that. Some of the keys here is that the employee's primary duty must be managing. This means that you're not doing shelving, you're not doing cleaning, you're not doing circ desk, you're not doing yard work. And most of you in the smaller libraries are doing all of those things at the same time as you're doing all of these things. So it talks about, the next thing it says there is that the employee must customarily and regularly direct the work of at least 2 or more other full-time employees or their equivalent. Now that's saying you must supervise 2 FTE. 1 full-time equivalent is 40 hours of work. 2 would be 80 hours in a pay period. So if you're going to claim this exemption, you have to supervise 80 hours of work by any number of other employees in the pay period or the work week. So if you have whatever your work week is, if you have 80 hours of other employees' time, you could meet this exemption as long as you're supervising them. Most of you don't have 2 other full-time employees. You may have 1 full-time employee, another one, and then several part-time employees. But if you add all their hours up in a work week and it equals 80 hours or more, you could meet this exemption, as long as you also have the authority to hire and fire, that your recommendations about advancement and promotion, change of status, you either can do it on your own or what you take to the board is given significant weight. I'm going to post, all these come from the Department of Labor fact sheets. And so my intent is to do a blog post with this recording, a copy of the slides with the notes, and then all the fact sheets that I pulled this information from. Okay, next test. So say I met the salary and but I don't supervise employees, so enough employee hours in a work week, so that blows this exemption. The next one would be considered the administrative duties test. And the important thing to notice here is that the primary duties must be performance of office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operation. And that you must be able to exercise discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of great significance. I thought that was a very interesting terminology. But it says here within the fact sheet that even if an employee's decisions are revised or reversed after review, it does not mean that the employee is not exercising discretion and independent judgment. The exercise of discretion and independent judgment must be more than the use of skill in applying well-established techniques, procedures, or specific standards in manuals or other sources. In other words, just following best practice is not enough. When it says matters of significance, it refers to the level of importance or consequence of the work performed. Helping draft that budget, helping develop the strategic plan for point of discussion. Those would be administrative duties. And, you know, the majority of your time needs to be in the performance of office or non-manual work, which does not mean shelving books. It does not mean working the circ desk. Those are things you can do, but that can't be the majority of your time. So maybe you could meet that test. The next test is the one for professional employees. And there are two types of employee classification, and this sort of gets interesting. The first is the learned. So if you have an education-based professional employee, that means they've taken advanced knowledge in a field of science or learning. In our case, that means if you have a Master's of Library Science. Now, you can have a Master's of Library Science and not meet the other two legs of this stool. So you could have a duties test you pass, but they're not paying you enough. Or you could have been hired into a job that was classified as non-exempt from the very beginning. So just having an MLS is not enough. If you have to meet the other standards, and your job description really should state whether you are exempt or non-exempt and on what basis. The other professional classification is creative. I know we're all creative. I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. But you have to be in a field where you have to have invention, imagination, originality, or talent in a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. I don't know that this applies to most library staffing positions, but you could always make your case. The last duties test is the computer employee duties test. And I would tell you that almost no library I can think of in the medium and small range has an employee that is this highly trained. Applications of systems analysis techniques and procedures, consulting with users and determining hardware and software specifications, design and implementation of systems or programs. Most of you do not have anyone that meets this exemption test. If you think you do, be sure and send me the job description. I'll be glad to look at it and talk with the technology staff, and we can consult about it. This is going to be a systems administrator in a large library. That's just my personal opinion. I will tell you also, I should have mentioned this earlier, I'm not going into detail about highly compensated employees. I'm really not taking every FLSA is actually much more complicated if you read these fact sheets. But bear in mind, you are a library, and think about this in terms of your library positions, and that's kind of where my focus has been here. So after looking at all those tests, I think the majority of libraries, especially medium and small, some of the directors are going to actually be exempt. In that case, how you're paid to actually become exempt is an issue, and how much you're paid. And realize that very likely the new law is going to be somewhere between the one that they thought they would implement and the one that is. So I'm guessing that salary range will be less than the $47,476, but more than the $23,660. So if you think that you are exempt and you want to proceed that way under the current existing rules, I'd be glad to help you with how you set up the pay for an exempt employee and how you rewrite that job description. Otherwise, most of you need to realize that you and your staff are non-exempt. And that means that the overtime versus compensatory time will come into play. Now, before I move on to this, did I totally confuse everyone about those job duties? Anybody have any questions? Okay, moving right along. So we now know overtime or compensatory time is really for non-exempt staff. Overtime. It's required for time over 40 hours in a work week. And one thing about it, if you pay overtime, it doesn't create scheduling problems. And there is a fact sheet, it's fact sheet 17B. Most of you, actually that's not the right fact sheet. Wrong, it's number 7, fact sheet number 7. Because you are a local government entity, you are covered under FLSA, and FLSA will allow compensatory time at a rate of 1.5 times the rate of pay. So you don't have to pay overtime. You may choose to pay overtime if you have a small staff and you have a really hard time scheduling someone else to work hours because of giving compensatory time. So if you had an employee in this situation, a non-exempt employee that actually worked 42 hours in the work week and the pay period was monthly, you could pay them for 40 hours in the first work week and have them work 37 hours in the, I'm getting my examples confused. In this, you would just flat pay them for the 42 hours. So the rate of pay for the 2 hours of overtime would become $18 an hour, which is the $12 times 1.5. That means that 2 hours would cost you $36. If you have a hard time getting your part-time people in to cover somebody that's there full-time, this may be an option. It's not illegal. So compensatory time off. In a work week with that 42 hours, you'd have the person that worked the 42 hours, you would only pay them for 40 for the 1 week. But the 2 hours would be subject to the 1.5 times for overtime. So that 2 hours becomes 3 hours of compensatory time off. So in best practice, you would in the next work week or the work week after that, in that same pay period, get the employee to work 37 hours, but you pay them for 40. That would get you this compensatory. They're getting the same amount of money, 3 hours at $12 an hour, or that same $36. So either way, they're getting the same amount of money for the employee. The problem or advantage comes to the employer. So if you look at this in overtime, you paid 2 hours of overtime for $36, but you didn't have to change your schedule because the next week they're back for their 40-hour week and you have a person in the job. The problem comes, and I've heard this from more than one library, compensatory time off. So I'm going to pay that employee the $36 and they're not going to work that 3 hours. Now that person works circ desk. So I have to have coverage there. So I have to find part-time staff to cover for that missing person. Just to give you an example, if you had a part-time staff person that even made less, say that $10 an hour, to work that 3 hours, you have to pay them $30 at the same time you're paying that other employee $36. And that means that those 3 hours really cost you in compensatory time off $66. Now, that doesn't hold true if you cover with the desk with another full-time employee who ceases to do what they were doing. This really is true when you have to bring or ask a part-timer to cover for a full-time person you're giving compensatory time off. Is that just clear as mud? Jerry, does that make sense to you or not? Anybody? It's something to think about. And
I do have one question, Laura.
Sure.
We just took care of this last night at a board meeting. And is the law still the same, the FLSA law, where it states that, you know, when that should be used, but then in the last sentence of it, it says other arrangements may be negotiated providing there is mutual agreement between the board and the library director. Is that still true?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
So for example, you have staff that works 80 hours a week easily. You're large enough.
Yeah.
You meet these requirements in terms of the percentage of you. So you supervise, you meet that supervision requirement. You could pass either the executive or the administrative test.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as long as you are compensated at a level amount each month, and that amount meets that threshold, you're exempt. And you only turn in your leave. Now, if you have to turn in a timesheet with the hours exact, you're not exempt.
Okay.
So we might have some things to think about there. But the other thing is to think about this, paying the overtime versus the compensatory time off. The other thing I didn't factor in here is overtime is actually a fairly simple payment transaction for the person doing your payroll.
Mm-hmm.
Redoing a work schedule and juggling that takes time, management time that would normally not be spent on that task.
Right.
I'm just, you know, I hadn't really for years thought about it in this way, but as I was doing this, I was thinking there are some cases, depending on your staffing model, where overtime might just be the way to go for some non-exempt staff. And the key there would be to manage the work environment so that that very rarely happens. So that's kind of this little riff I was doing. The whole point here is that most of you have non-exempt staff. And some directors are going to be exempt, but the smaller the library, the less likely that is to be true. So when you see this discussion come again, just remember there are the 3 tests. There's the salary level, there are the duties tests, and we'll put those up on our website so you can find them. But it's the Federal Department of Labor, and if you typed in FLSA fact sheets in their search window, you get all the fact sheets you need on this. I'll copy them and also put them up in the blog post. So for trustees, the important thing to look at is when you write the job descriptions, and as director, when you work with them, when you write this job descriptions, you really need to start from the beginning. Is this going to be an exempt employee or a non-exempt employee? Think through those tests and say, this is a non-exempt employee. So then you need to say that. The best protection you have is to have that, say that right in the job description as a classification. And the other thing to know is just because you are the library director does not mean if they do not handle these 3 tests in the appropriate way that you will be considered exempt if you ever have an audit. If the IRS for some reason or the Kansas Department of Revenue for some reason came in and you're not doing this correctly, they aren't necessarily going to jump all over you. They're going to say, don't do this anymore. But if it was a repetitive pattern, they could charge you penalties and interest, and that employee could be liable to go back on you for overtime pay. So I just wanted to make sure that we spend a little time thinking about, first of all, full-time does not mean you can't, anything less than 40 hours a week is only applicable to benefits. Fair Labor Standards Act says very clearly 40 hours a week. So if I have an employee that only works 20 hours a week, you're not paying them overtime until they hit 40. Overtime happens after 40 hours a week. How you choose to pay it can vary. Compensatory time is allowed for state and government agencies. Now, if your CPA says differently, trust them. I'm not a CPA. So if there's a difference of opinion, let me know and we'll talk. I need to learn things too. Anybody have any other questions? Jackie, did we answer your questions?
I think so. I had looked at some things earlier trying to decide if the 3 people that are classified as salary should be hourly. And a class I'd taken like years ago, they said, if any part of a person's job was hourly, to always classify them as hourly to protect them.
Sure.
And so,
yeah, the one other term that you can run into is you'll hear the term salary hourly or hourly salary.
mm-hmm.
We have non-exempt people here that I pay the same amount of money every month rather than actually, even though they give me a timesheet, that way their pay is level. And I do that as a convenience because if they're full-time, they're working 2,080 hours a year. So I would put in my job ad, a $36,000 position. I would divide it by 12 and pay them $3,000 a month. So I'm not going to vary that unless there's some other situation, an exception that comes up. But I've still classified that as an hourly non-exempt position. It's the classification because what they do and how they do it does not meet the job duties test.
Okay, I think that helps.
All right, okay. I know the more you talk about it, the more confused you get. At least that's how it happens to me. Anybody else have any other questions? If you think of something later, feel free to give me a call. And if you disagree, very definitely give me a call and educate me.
Yeah, I have some questions about it because we just voted on something last night, and I'm not sure, are we in compliance or not? Are we good?
I think so. An exempt employee would have to meet 3 of the tests that you went over, correct?
They have to meet a certain salary level, which you meet. I know you meet that.
Right.
It needs to be paid in equal amounts,
Okay.
monthly amounts. Are you a monthly payer?
No, but we did bi-weekly, twice a month or whatever you call it. And we,
That's semi-monthly. So that's, you've got 26 pay periods no, 24 pay periods in semi-monthly. Like if you paid on the 1st and the 15th or the 15th and the 30th, set dates, that's semi-monthly.
Right. Twice a month.
yeah.
The same amount. You're paid the same amount.
Yeah,
every month.
I'm always paid the same amount, even though I do fill out a timesheet and I'm considered an hourly employee.
Well, they just need to change the discussion there, because technically I would classify you as exempt. That you supervise 80 hours of other people's time in a month. You have a salary, you're paid the same amount every month, you meet all 3 tests. You're an exempt employee. That timesheet you turn in should only have vacation and sick leave, jury duty, holidays, and just holidays for the convenience of it. And mostly, if you work 50 hours in 1 week and you rearrange the schedule so you're only there 35 hours the next week and 35 hours the week after that, that's your call.
Okay.
As long as you get the work done.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and what we've been doing is I just get comp time,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how we've been doing it forever. And
But I think when you were a smaller library, that was absolutely correct.
so now you're saying they really don't need to give me comp time? Is that what you're saying?
You're taking your own comp time, but it isn't affecting your pay. In other words, you don't have to account for the comp time.
Right. So you shouldn't be.
Externally, you're accounting for it internally because you're an exempt employee.
Okay.
Right.
They can fire you because you're not getting anything done, and you're not showing up enough. But they can't. If they dock your pay, then change your status.
Okay.
Okay. Now we've set our full-time employees at 39 hours, though, right?
No, they're 40 hours, and they get time and a half period. We don't do comp time with them at all. They just get overtime.
Okay.
When they go over 40 hours in 1 work week.
Yeah, so your management style is to minimize that. And that's why you figure out how much everybody's salary is normally. And then you're going to add a little bit extra for that overtime you have to pay, or that compensatory time where you have to bring another employee in to cover the position.
Mm-hmm.
So you figure out what everybody's salary is and then add 1% to give yourself a little wiggle room there, because you may go over the, parts are smaller than the whole. They're not equal. In other words, if I added everybody's salary up and then I went in and I don't have any room for overtime.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
1% for budget purposes. That makes sense.
Okay.
Anybody else have a question? Well, have a wonderful evening, and I'll hopefully get rid of this cold and sound better, Jerry. I apologize.
No, I just feel bad for you. It seems like you've been sick for quite a while. So
Yeah, I know. I got to take my vitamins.